Hello and welcome. I'm Elizabeth Otters-White, and I'm excited to share this abbreviated version of a presentation I gave recently at the annual meeting of the American Association for Anatomy. So I chose the title of this talk carefully, so I want to say a little bit about that. First of all, exploring pathways to peace. The word exploring is really important here because depending on where we are, peace may feel very far away. And my intention is to share tools and techniques that will help us no matter where we are on that pathway. You'll notice that I use the word trauma in the subtitle, Caring for Ourselves and Others Experiencing Academic Trauma. And I want to acknowledge that I'm using that term to refer to any distressing experience that exceeds our ability to cope, that overwhelms our system and causes psychological damage. For most academics, work-related trauma doesn't stem from a catastrophic event, although that is certainly possible. More often it comes from that accumulation of repetitive negative experiences that people sometimes refer to as little t trauma, though I also want to acknowledge that that term can be controversial. I also want to emphasize that one experience might be traumatizing for one person and not for another, right? Everyone is different. And finally, if you're not comfortable with the word trauma here, please just feel free to substitute in something that you prefer, whether that's overwhelm, suffering, something like that. As we get started, I want to acknowledge that I am not a psychologist or a mental health professional. Instead, my knowledge of these topics stems from a lot of personal and professional exploration and learning, both on my own and through my work with hundreds of academic clients. I also want to emphasize that in this presentation, I'm focusing on things we can do ourselves and with others, rather than on the systemic change that is clearly needed. That said, I do believe that the healthier we become individually and collectively, the better we are able to affect the change we want to see and to create the positive environment that we seek. Most important, if at any point this presentation brings up feelings or memories that are hard for you to process on your own, please do stop, take care of yourself, and seek assistance if needed. So where are we heading? I hope that by the end of this presentation, we will all have three things. The first is a sense of the sources of trauma commonly experienced by higher ed professionals. I suspect that you may already be very familiar with these. The second is the ability to maybe better recognize the impact of these experiences on ourselves and on others. And then finally, number three, most important, I think, ways to help promote healing for ourselves and for those around us. Okay, I'm going to go through this slide pretty quickly, and you can pause it if you'd like to spend more time here. I do want to say that this particular slide is intentionally designed to evoke a sense of overwhelm, so I hope it accomplishes that goal. What I'm doing here is introducing some of the common sources of trauma within an academic context. So in addition to the behaviors on the upper left that we might normally think of as traumatic, there are many other sources of potential trauma, including the academic norms and structures and the broader context, which is intensely challenging right now, at least in the United States. So with that backdrop, I'd like to share some of the different ways that these traumatic experiences can impact us, right? How they manifest, explore their impacts. And the first kind of expression of that, the feeling that I'd like to talk about, is this sense of being all alone. I have certainly experienced that. I've heard many others talk about it, sometimes directly expressing it, sometimes indirectly. But it's this feeling of maybe feeling unseen, as if we don't belong, we're not valued or supported. And it can result in hypervigilance, where we're constantly on alert. We're being careful, monitoring everything we say, really paying attention to everyone's reactions to us. And that sense of separation and isolation can also lead to perfectionism, because we may feel that we can't afford to make a mistake. There's no one there to back us up, right? Now, this may not even be objectively true, but this is often how we feel. We feel all alone. Another way this might manifest is a sense that it's never enough. No matter what I do, it's never enough. And I think what often underlies this is really a sense that I'm never enough, right? And when we feel this way, we can easily get trapped in anxiety and worry. We might get defensive because we feel like we constantly need to prove ourselves. And this can lead to us working harder and harder in hopes of doing that, which can then in turn make us resentful, right? This feeling of like, why do I have to work all the time? And I think you can get the idea of this vicious cycle of bitterness and disempowerment that can result from these feelings of it's never enough or I'm never enough. And, I think we're all familiar with imposter syndrome. You may have even said yourself, I suffer from imposter syndrome. This is really common. I will say I don't love this term. I think it's more about an experience that we have, a crisis of confidence created by our environment. But people use the phrase a lot, and it's clearly connected to this sense of not being enough. I think these feelings can also result in an inability to detach, right? Thinking about work all the time, ruminating. Our sense of identity can be so tied up in our work that even when we're taking a break, we're not really taking a mental break. And I'll also say before I move on that I'm describing these feelings, these impacts kind of one by one as if they're really distinct, but in fact, there's a lot of overlap here, a lot of blending. Beyond it's never enough, we might feel like this isn't what I thought it was going to be. We may have this sense of disillusionment, of feeling deflated and defeated, maybe sleeping poorly, having trouble concentrating. This can also show up as being unable to complete tasks unless we're under a really tight deadline. So in a sense, really, this is burnout. Myself, I often expressed it as hanging on by a thread. And we obviously can't do the kind of work we want to do when we're barely hanging on. And finally, at some point, we just give up. We feel helpless. There can be almost a sense of confusion, like this utter disbelief, this sense of how did I get here? Sort of a fuzziness around that. And when we get to this point, we probably aren't functioning, certainly not functioning well, if at all. We may have significant health crises, and we may ultimately leave our institution or leave academia altogether. So how can we help, right? How can we help if we or others are experiencing one of these things? Well, first of all, I want to just acknowledge that this has already been a lot. So if you need to pause and take a break, please do. If you want to take a couple deep breaths, if you might want to, shake your body. I'm actually doing that myself right now as I'm recording this, just to release some of this stress. And then as we continue, I'll just say, if you remember nothing from this presentation except this slide here, I think that's fantastic. I think that's more than enough, because from my perspective, this is the most critical material, and everything on the subsequent slides and the slides before just support this, right? And that is the idea here, that everything starts with awareness. If we don't know what we're experiencing, if we don't know what's going on, it's very difficult to do anything, right? To make any positive changes. So the first thing we need to do is like pause every once in a while, which can be very difficult for those of us who are used to running a mile a minute, as is the case for almost all academics. So we do need to pay attention to ourselves, to the physical sensations in our body, to the thoughts that we're having, to the emotions that we're experiencing, right? So stop every once in a while just to check in with ourselves, or to do the same with others, right? To notice perhaps the way they're carrying themselves or their tone of voice as best we can, right? And then when we're talking about others and how to support others, we really want to validate with compassion. So this involves listening with our full presence, ensuring that the person feels heard and seen. And just remember, validation doesn't mean that we're agreeing, right? It doesn't mean that we agree with what they're saying. It simply means that we're listening We're allowing them to have their experience. We're not interrupting, and we're not trying to change or fix anything unless we've been asked explicitly to do that, right? And in the case of ourselves, we want to do the same thing. We want to bring that validation and compassion. It can be harder to do that for ourselves. Again, it starts with awareness, right? It starts with pausing and paying attention without judgment, bringing curiosity, noticing how we're feeling, and being kind to ourselves. And I'm not going to say more about the particular techniques. There are a lot of ways to bring compassion to ourselves and others. And I do have a guide that I will mention at the end of this presentation, how you can get a copy of this, where I say a little bit more and I share some more resources around many of the techniques that I'm speaking about here. All right. So now let's talk more specifically about some particular ways of helping, first on our own and then with others. This is also a somewhat false distinction. But the techniques on this first slide do focus a bit more on inner work, and on the next slide on things we can do together. So when we've experienced trauma or we're feeling overwhelmed, it's really important to remember and acknowledge where we have agency and to know that we almost always have choices. Doesn't mean that those choices don't have consequences, but it's important to know that we can choose. And we also need to trust in our own knowing. And remember that we don't have to be like everyone else. We don't have to do it the way everyone else does it. Real self-care is also vital and requires being self-aware. I really like that. Self-care, self-aware, right? A massage or a day at the spa might be your perfect form of self-care, but someone else might need to go to a protest. That might be exactly what they need to do to care for themselves. So it's really about awareness and then carving out time to honor what we know about ourselves, what we know we need. Boundaries are also really crucial. This includes saying no, which I know firsthand can be incredibly difficult when we want to try to be helpful. And yet we can't actually be helpful if we're running ourselves ragged, right? So these boundaries are really critical. Distance, I'll say, is connected to that. It can be physical distance or emotional distance, right? So it can even be just writing down our thoughts on a piece of paper and then sticking that in the back of a drawer, or lighting that paper on fire, or flushing it down the toilet, right? Whatever. We can do that literally in the real world, or we can kind of do that as a visualization in our minds. There are lots of other approaches as well to creating distance. Positive self-talk, in my experience, is an absolute game changer. I have an entire mini course on this topic, and it's free, so I'm not going to say much more about it here. You can check that out if you're curious. But I will say that it starts with non-judgmental awareness, with just noticing with curiosity and really beginning to love and appreciate ourselves, just as we would a dear friend. And finally, somatic techniques. There's so much work exploring how our body holds trauma and emotion. So body-centered approaches are incredibly important for healing, whether that involves particular types of breathing or maybe holding a pillow to our abdomen to create a sense of safety. There are lots of techniques, and I do share some more resources in the guide that I mentioned and that I will say more about in a few minutes. Okay, so moving on to things that involve others. The power of social support, the benefit of connecting with people who share our experience is immense. It allows us to share our burdens. It allows us to feel seen and heard, right? Coming back to validation. I think it is an absolutely critical form of support and can be hard sometimes for introverts to access or to create these relationships and support networks in academia. It's really, really important. Similarly, I think creating safe spaces in which to process, to grieve. I just think about the COVID pandemic, for example, and how we all just kind of moved on. Like, think about all of the huge impact of that. And then it's as if nothing happened. We're just, quote, back to normal. No opportunity to process that, to acknowledge all of that collective trauma. Advocacy and guidance, I think, are fairly self-explanatory. We can, speak up on behalf of others, help others navigate the systems. In some cases, this may be, helping people become aware of institutional resources, right, which is the next bullet point. and helping them access those services, whether it's an ombuds office or employee assistance. It's also important to encourage others and ourselves, right, to take advantage of things outside our institutions, whether that's mental health resources, coaching, groups, again, for that social support, other types of support, maybe through professional associations. And then finally, I do just want to explicitly mention FMLA. This is Family and Medical Leave Act in the United States. I don't apologize, I don't know as much in other countries. I took advantage of this, and I have several clients who have done so as well. This can be a critically important form of support and allow us to maintain some well being or to heal. So I do encourage people to take advantage of this when necessary. All right, we've reached the end. Thank you so much for your time. And wherever you are in this moment, whether you're at a peak or in a valley, I really hope that you found something of value in this presentation. If you did, please share it with others who may benefit. And if you'd like to receive a free copy of Resourced and Ready, The Ultimate R&R, please sign up for my mailing list. There should be a link somewhere handy, and that will hopefully not only help us heal now, but continue to enhance our resilience and our ability to respond skillfully to whatever comes our way in the future. And it will help us change the system to make it healthier and more resilient. Please reach out to me to share your comments or questions, thoughts, any suggestions you have. I really do want to hear from you. And as always, thanks for being here and thanks for being you.